like to welcome everybody to this morning's meeting of the London Assembly Economy Committee. I'd like to welcome the Assembly members, our invited expert guests, and also members of the public who are either here or watching on the webcast. Today's meeting is going to focus on future jobs and skills that we need in a low-carbon circular economy. And we encourage anyone who wants to take part in the discussion on social media to use the hashtags #Assembly Economy and #Circular Economy. Now, we've got a few short other items of formal business to go through first before we get to our expert guests. And can I just remind everybody, including our guests and also Assembly members, that however fascinating your ringtone is, could you please put your phone on silent so that we don't hear it. Have we got any apologies?
No apologies, Chair.
Okay, in fact I can see there are no apologies. The second item of business is declarations of interest, which are found on pages 1 to 4 in your agenda pack. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out at item 2, and can I just check if anyone's got any other interest to declare? No? Noted, didn't it? Okay, thank you. The minutes are to be found on the previous meeting on the 9th of July, are to be found on pages 5 to 42 in the agenda pack. Can we agree the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 9th of July as a true record? Agreed. Thank you. We have a summary list of actions in your agenda pack on pages 43 to 118. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings? Noted. And action taken under delegated authority is set out on pages 119 to 136. Can we note the recent action taken by the Chair of the Economy Committee, me, under delegated authority as set out in that agenda item? And that brings us smoothly on to the main item on today's agenda, which is to have a question and answer session with our guests, who I'm very delighted to welcome to City Hall, and thank you very much for sparing the time this morning. And I'd just like to introduce Simon Wyke, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is the Principal Policy and Programme Officer in the GLA, Anne Pettifor, who is listed in my notes as being a political economist, author of the Green New Deal, but I believe was quite closely associated with Jubilee 2000 and a number of other things. Richard Howard, who's listed as Research Director at Aurora, but has been here in his previous guise from the Policy Exchange. Isabella Gornall, who I don't think has been with us before. No, well, you're very, very welcome, Isabella. And I believe you're the Managing Director of Seahourse Environmental Communications, but also you're on the board of UK 100. Yeah. And finally, our other guest this morning is Graham Petersen, who has been with us before, not necessarily before the Economy Committee, and Graham is the Secretary of the Greener Jobs Alliance. So you're all very welcome this morning, and thank you very much for coming. So we're going to start with some questions from me, which are going to be on a sort of more overview level before we move into the more detailed questions from other Assembly members. And I'm just going to start with a very open-ended question, which is how important is it that London's economy transitions to a low-carbon circular economy? I'm going to start with Anne and then Richard, and then I'm going to see if anyone else wants to come in.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's an honour to be invited here. Thank you for having me. Gosh, how important is it? I can't stress the importance just looking out the window at our river, the Thames, and knowing that with the rise in sea levels, cities that are on the edge of rivers and close to the sea are deeply exposed to the threat of climate breakdown. And not just that, but we're also living through an era in which we're losing biomass on a scale unprecedented in history, and that threatens our food supply ultimately. And these threats are very near, they're very close. And London is a big packed city. I live here, and I worry about what will happen when floods come or when fires come. So it's clear that it's urgent and we need to act very quickly. The science is telling us that. The politicians have been far too slow to respond. And the economists have also, I think, failed us in the sense of not providing an alternative system. Now, for me, what's really important, about the Green New Deal and about the need for a transformation is that we're going to have to be able to finance it. And to be able to finance it, in my view, we're going to need to have, government is going to need to be in the driving seat, as government would be were we to go to war, for example. And I think the threat we face is on that scale. But for government to be in the driving seat in terms of policy making and financial mobilisation requires that the City of London takes the back seat. And that takes a lot of change, transformation, and the subordination, if you like, of the finance sector to the interests of the economy as a whole. So London has an important part to play, both in protecting itself, but also in mobilising, helping to mobilise the finance that is going to be needed to protect the rest of the country.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. I'm going to bring in Richard, who may or may not agree with that. And Anne did say not just how important it is, but also how urgent it is. So
yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose I'd frame why do we need to do anything about this? I think there's both an environmental and economic consideration, well, socio-economic consideration that we could make. On the climate side, there has been an agreement at global level under the Paris Agreement that we want to reduce emissions and keep global warming within 2 degrees and ideally target 1.5 degrees. London isn't going to achieve that on its own, but it can make its contribution, as every city and every country will need to make. And I think as a global city, London can also be an example of how to do this well, if London can do it well, and be an example for other cities to follow. London can't do it on its own, though. If you think about the economy of London and what the emissions base is of London, it's difficult to think about London as an island. London imports many products, food, manufactured products and services. It exports lots of goods and services as well. And so if we're thinking about the carbon footprint of London, it's almost impossible to think of London as an island in isolation. I think you have to think also about the wider carbon footprint that London has beyond the M25, let's say. So that's a really important part of this. So if you want to decarbonise the energy use in London, it can partly be about reducing the amount of energy use in London, but you also need to think about where is that energy coming from, and most of it comes from outside London's border. So I think those are all important parts of this overall frame. From an economic point of view, there are opportunities here for jobs associated with this transition. If London can position itself and work with its strengths in particular sectors that are likely to be important in the low carbon transition. For example, there are many people in London. London has a specialisation around finance and business services. There are many people who work in finance and business services who are working on projects that are important in the low carbon transition, not here, but literally around the world. I know because I work with quite a lot of them. So that's just one example of how London can benefit from, economically, from a low carbon transition that's happening elsewhere. I'll end my comments there for now, but there's plenty more I could add.
I thought you might come at this at slightly different perspectives from each other. I'm actually going to bring in Isabella now. Yes, I think if we ask you to make a contribution on this, and then I'll move on to my next question and bring you in, Simon, if I may. Isabella.
Yeah, I think, when you ask how important is it for London, we need to look at the significance of London as a major global city and it as our capital city. If London can achieve this, it sets the bar in terms of what can be done around the world as well, but also London as a figurehead and city hall, you also have to compare that to what central government is also doing and what that means for the rest of the UK as well. So I do think it is hugely significant for London to be able to do that. And we've talked about some of the environmental, social, economic benefits. We also have to think about the risks if you don't, and flooding and heat waves. And I think that is hugely important. I mean, personally, I think we need to stay optimistic about this and think about the benefits, but you can't ignore the risks if we don't do it.
Right. Simon, I'd like to bring you in now, and obviously feel free to comment on the importance and the urgency to London's economy as well. But what would you say are the challenges for cities like London in moving towards a low-carbon circular economy? It very much builds on from the last points that Isabella was making.
Thanks very much, and it's like sort of really pleased to be here, and it's sort of really interesting panel, and look forward to the discussion. Yeah, just sort of picking up on sort of some of the things that have been sort of said in the previous question. Sort of agree totally in the requirements for sort of the speed, the necessity, the environmental requirements. And it's not just a climate thing, it's also sort of an environmental thing. It's biodiversity, it looks at sort of environmental pollution, it's about environmental degradation, the use of natural resources. So I think sort of the importance is not only an environmental one, but it's also an economic one. And I think that's a really good opportunity for us, because there are challenges here in London. We've got sort of a range of challenges in London that we need to address, whether that's air quality, whether that's decarbonisation, whether that's like sort of natural green space. So those are similar challenges are sort of seen around the world. Obviously, sort of they change in their slightly in their sort of magnitude and sort of the focus and things. But sort of the challenges that we'll be facing here as a city are sort of similar to those that will be sort of faced elsewhere. And we must see this within the global context. I don't think we can sort of look at London and sort of say, okay, then if London's going to sort of work at this, then we can do this in isolation. I think actually sort of what we need to see is a national effort, it's a continental effort, and it's a sort of a global effort. So that, and we heard about how the economy changes. And I think that's a really important aspect, because at the moment the economy values financial outcomes. But actually sort of what we're trying to do is create an economic framework which actually sort of values social and environmental outcomes as well. And then that enables businesses to be able to make more decisions based on social and environmental outcomes as well, because you're starting to internalise those externalities which at the moment aren't, and sort of it's why the sort of the market sort of always sort of moves to sort of the most financially valuable or favourable solution, as opposed to the sort of maybe the most sustainable solution. So I think it's sort of really important that we look at it as a global economic shift, and we sort of think about how the economy is going to be able to change to actually like sort of value social and environmental outcomes. Thinking about sort of some of the challenges, there's sort of a lot of challenges sort of in London that we have. There's sort of, we've got environmental challenges that we're sort of looking to sort of address here, some of which we're able to sort of affect and sort of drive solutions for to London level, others which we don't sort of have the powers for. We sort of will need sort of national government to be able to sort of regulate, sort of put policy in, create funding streams that will sort of allow us to address some of those. But I think sort of we've got, so we do need stable policy and regulation, sort of something that allows business to say, okay, I can see where we're going, and I can see that if I make those investments, then those investments are investments for the future, and they will reward me, and I will be a more competitive business as a consequence. I think that's really important that we sort of we set that policy and regulatory framework so people have got the confidence, and we keep it in constant. I think sort of access to finance and things as well, sort of providing businesses with the opportunities to sort of invest and develop and grow, and often sort of where they're investing in areas where sort of maybe the market isn't always favouring a low carbon solution currently, then like sort of how do we support those businesses to sort of bring those innovations to provide those goods and services to be able to sort of decarbonise. I think also like sort of the importance of consumers, so the challenges of engaging citizens and sort of consumers within the market. Sort of obviously sort of as a public sector we can help to drive demand by like sort of procurement processes and sort of demanding environmentally friendly goods and services, but also consumers have got a really important part to play. And like sort of, and if they can sort of make those demands around like sort of those environmentally sensitive goods and services as well, then that changes the sort of the economic look, and actually sort of businesses start saying, okay, then there is a sort of a clear market there for me to be able to supply into.
I'm going to open that up to anyone else who wants to comment on what the challenges are for cities like London in terms of that transition process. And I can see that Richard is nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, happy to jump in.
And then Graham.
So I agreed with many of the things that were said, but I'd like to highlight 5 things which I think are big challenges. The first is really around the cost and lack of incentives for individuals and companies to pursue low carbon opportunities. Where is the incentive for people to invest in energy efficiency or improve recycling as individuals or individual businesses. Those incentives are quite weak because we tend to not internalise the externalities that come with not doing those things. Compounding that is a set of behavioural barriers that people don't like changing the way they do things. And you need to overcome that. If people are very familiar with using a gas boiler, they're unlikely to be wanting to jump in and change that and switch it to an air source heat pump because they don't know what that is going to do for them. Thirdly, London, as I've already sort of said, London cannot do all of this on its own and become a low-carbon circular economy. It's part of a wider UK, European, global economy and an ecosystem, and so London will necessarily have to coordinate with UK government, with other bodies to effect change here. It can't do it on its own. And the fourth and fifth ones are linked. London is growing significantly in terms of population, housing, economic activity, and with that comes an ever more difficult challenge if you want to drive the emissions and footprint of that growth down to zero. You're starting from, you're fighting just to keep the footprint as it is with all of that growth, let alone try and drive it down. And one particular aspect of that is around space, land use. So there are many things that London could do to reduce its environmental footprint, but there's an opportunity cost because you could go and advocate building some solar farms, for example. That would be one use of some land, but there are many other uses of that land, like building houses or offices or leisure, whatever. Those are all challenges which are particularly acute in a city like London.
Yes, the planning system since 2000, when we had the first mayoralty, has had safeguarded wharves along the river. So there are some parts of the river where we don't have blocks of flats, and we also have safeguarded industrial land, and the pressure on both of those is quite intense, as you can imagine. I saw Anne and then I saw Graham. Anne.
So I want to agree that there's a lack of incentives and that we're going to have to work internationally and coordinate at a national level, of course. But there's two things. One, the reason we don't have incentives is because our government and our politicians on the whole are not providing those incentives. And the reason they're not doing that is because they're overly reliant on the market to provide incentives. Now, the market's incentives are to expand exponentially what economists call growth. And the market's incentive is to ignore boundaries and move across boundaries. One of the reasons why we have a rise in population growth, why we have floods of money coming into London, is because we deny the importance of boundaries. Now, I think boundaries are incredibly important for policy making. You can't make policy on pensions, on taxation, on all kinds of really important governmental policy in the absence of boundaries. If you're going to pay pensions to people in Africa, who don't pay taxes, it gets quite complicated. Or if you're going to try and tax people in California who don't live in London, that too is complicated. Admittedly, the Americans managed to do that, but that's unique. So for me, what's really important is that our government should, at a national level, take action, and our politicians should exercise leadership and not leave everything to free market forces. And I want to just remind you of the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer. That was indeed an international agreement that did take international coordination, and of course, the ozone is not a national thing that recognises boundaries. But the protocol demanded that at national level, action should be taken and enforced at national level. So while it's true that we're going to need international coordination, we're going to need government to be in the driving seat. I repeat that again. And to introduce policies and enforce those policies within our boundaries. And that's got to happen here, it's got to happen in South Africa, it's got to happen in Korea, all over the place. And we can do that, as we did so successfully with the Montreal Protocol, but only if we give governments authority. Now, in Britain, governments lack that authority. Governments, we've more or less privatized and marketized all of the nation's assets, so that the important things and the incentives that have to be changed are not in political hands. And that, for us, is a very big problem. It's a big problem for London, but it's a big problem for the country. And until we change that system, and we reclaim some of those assets, and above all, we reclaim public authority over these issues and not private authority over these issues, it's not going to be possible to take the sort of urgent action that we're talking about. And can I just say that it's true people don't like adapting, you know, but when we prepared for the World War II, you know, we had to adapt massively, and we did. Those of us who didn't, those of the British people who didn't go to war and died, actually had a decent standard of living and found that all of the changes that were made, the rationing and all of that happened in order to secure the future, actually in many ways improved their well-being. So I think people are perfectly capable of adapting fast, but only if there's leadership and if there's actually a framework within which they can change, a legal framework.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Graham, and then I'm going to bring in Sean, who's shown that he wants to ask a question as well. Graham, you'd indicated to come in next.
Yes, thanks again for the opportunity to come and address the panel. Agree with a lot of the points that were made on the importance of this, obviously. Just three things perhaps to add very quickly. The first one is IPCC targets have been mentioned. And the importance of that is how urgent action over the next 12 years is required. So I think it's important to put this discussion in the context of the urgency of the issue and what London does and the rest of the world does in the next decade or so. The second point is that, as has been indicated, there are threats and opportunities here, and I think we do need to emphasise the opportunities. And for me, one really big opportunity is the point about addressing social justice issues. You know, after a decade or more of austerity, there's a real chance to look at the economy in a new way. If we're talking about something that's structurally so deep, has been indicated, rather than just tinkering with the edges, then unless we pick up this opportunity to address social justice, then we're really going to miss a trick. And the final point I suppose I'd make is that, again, there's a real opportunity with COP26 coming to the UK in 2020. There's a real chance here for the GLA and others to start getting together with community organisations, with business and employers to really engage on how we're going to deliver this and put out some really positive case studies. So that's that. On the challenges, I suppose make the point that obviously, as people said, London doesn't exist in a bubble. In many ways, it's the sum of its parts, even within London itself. And so clearly what local authorities do across London is actually going to be important. A number of local authorities have declared climate emergencies, including mine, Wandsworth. After a lot of lobbying and petitions, that was achieved. But what we need to do is interrogate the policies and the strategies that underpin those climate emergencies. And if you look at a lot of them, then they're very much back-ended in terms of the actions that are proposed. You know, they talk about targets of 2050, carbon neutrality or zero carbon to be achieved by that time. But a lot of the actions are very long-term, and this gets back to what I said at the beginning, the importance of the urgency of this issue. So I think if anyone is looking at what their local authority is doing, as well as what the GLA is doing, then we need to be looking at what are the priorities in front-loading any strategy. So I'd make that point, and then I suppose picking up on Anne's really important point.
So what you're asking us really to consider the urgency of the situation,
yes,
and making sure that the policies, because the Mayor's policy is not carbon neutrality but zero carbon by 2050, and we declared a climate emergency here last December that said carbon neutral by 2030. And a number of local authorities have said similar. I think Hammersmith and Fulham may even have gone for carbon neutral by 2025. But I think most have gone for about 2030. So you're saying the important period is from now, 2020 approximately, because that's where we are almost at the end of 2019, to 2030, to really front load activity to move us to both the low carbon and the circular economy, which is right.
Okay. And just the final point I wanted to make was to echo Anne's comments about the important role of government, but then within that, the role of the GLA in trying to influence government. And, you know, there's a whole range of things that if London's going to stand any chance of achieving this target, or these targets, then It won't do it, unfortunately, unless there is concerted effort at a government level. And there I mean things around taxation policy, investment policy, allocation of resources, the legal framework. You take things like clean air legislation and how that's achieved, and the enforcement to back it up. So all of those are going to be absolutely crucial, and so the lobbying role of the GLA is something that I'd certainly like to emphasise as well.
Okay, that's some very interesting points there. Sean, you wanted to come in.
Morning all. And I just want to quickly go back to a comment you made. You talked about things being beyond the government's control because they're all privatised. Could you give me an example of what do you mean as a, something that is beyond the government's control?
I'm talking about the major assets, the nation's assets, like our public transport system, like our energy system. These are not owned by the government. The government doesn't really have much sway over them. We rely on the private sector to act in dealing with those. So it's just very difficult for us but I mean, I walked around City Hall this morning, and the land outside this building is privately owned. There's a notice saying private property. If you want to do something to this land to protect City Hall from flooding, you've got to negotiate with private landlords. That's extraordinary. This public space, this is, and much of our public space is now privately owned. So it's hard to exercise control over that.
But you're suggesting that these things are beyond legal control, then, aren't you? Because the government doesn't need to own something to legislate for or against a thing happening.
Well, the point is the cost of that is going to be great to the government. Yes, of course, the government could act and could, enact laws and could, even regain these public assets, buy them back again, compensate shareholders. All of that can happen. That's going to be tiresome and going to take time. We don't have a lot of time. So my point is that overall, the economy is governed by private authority. The market decides, whether we're going to have cars, whether we're going to have electric cars, whether we're going to have electric charging points. The market decides. The government's not doing that. And so that would be fine if the market was reacting quickly enough and had the wisdom and the foresight and was concerned about the security of the people, whereas in fact the market is concerned about the returns to shareholders. That's their major obsession.
Surely you could see how someone would say that's not entirely accurate, because if I don't own something as a government but I can legislate to have that changed, I'll do that. That's much cheaper for me than buying it back and looking after. And the other concern I'd have, all of what we're talking about this morning is important but has a cost. So if we go around buying these things back, we're then unable to invest that money in making some of the changes that we want to see. And I find it hard to believe the government can't affect something that it doesn't own. They affect me every day and they don't own me.
I've just throw in at this point that Caroline and I, with our chair of the Environment Committee and Deputy Chair of the Environment Committee, yesterday had a very interesting meeting with the Environment Agency talking about the next Thames barrier and the need for it. And of course, one of the issues is about how do you negotiate where you've got land on either side of the Thames that isn't necessarily in public ownership, and what are the planning regulations. You've got a number of different authorities. CPO. And so from that point of view, I think things like trying to protect London around water, it would probably be easier for the Environment Agency if the assets were definitely in public hands. But at this point, I'm going to bring in Richard, because we've had a series of questions there from Sean.
So I just I suppose I'd like to argue probably pretty much the opposite of what Anne has been saying, which I think is the government absolutely can affect change through many things that it does. And we can also reduce our footprint at the same time as we grow. So to give a few data points and examples of that, the UK economy has grown, since 1990, the UK economy has grown nearly 80%, and it's cut its emissions in absolute terms at the same time by 40%. So if you think about
by exporting them abroad.
Well, okay, that's a point about how we record emissions, and the Committee on Climate Change has set out the way it does that. But emissions are recorded on a territorial basis and in all countries, and that's how people think about this. So my point is you can achieve growth and cut your emissions at the same time. One of the areas of the economy where emissions have fallen fastest is in the power sector, and one of the things that happened here is the government brought in an additional carbon tax on fossil fuel generation in 2013, and that has single-handedly, it's been absolutely instrumental in reducing coal generation from nearly 50% of the mix to almost zero, and in the period from 2013 until now. So the government absolutely can influence the outcomes through taxation policy, through regulation, through the controls that are put around regulated monopolies such as gas networks, electricity networks, and water companies and so on, can absolutely affect change in our infrastructure. So I think I don't know, I have a different perspective, which is that you can achieve growth and reduce your footprint at the same time. And I do think that the government has within its gift many things, many levers to pull if it wishes to do so. Many of those levers exist at national level rather than London level. So part of, again, I've said it a couple of times now, but I think there are many things that London can do, but a very big part of it will also be about working with national level bodies, including government and regulators, to see the things that London wants to happen.
So I want you all, certainly Richard and Anne, and then I'll see if anyone else wants to answer this. I want you now to try and imagine what would be the impact on London's economy if London was going through this transition towards a low carbon and circular economy, and how might that look like, both the transition and perhaps think about what it might look like afterwards. I think, Richard, you touched on things like moving to air source heat pumps and things like that, but what could it mean, both the low carbon aspect but also the circular aspect? Because we've explored that in the Environment Committee, but not here. And of course the circular economy, the key word in that sentence is economy. And I'll then bring in Anne as well. Richard.
Yeah, so think about some of the individual component parts of what has to happen. For London to be low carbon and circular, we're going to need to invest significantly in improving the efficiency of our buildings in London. If you actually look at the carbon footprint of London, a large part of it is to do with the way we heat buildings and the way we use electricity in buildings, and we can massively reduce that through efficiency. That actually employs a lot of people in fitting insulation, in fitting new heating appliances, in improving electrical systems in buildings. That employs an awful lot of people. London is not self-sufficient in energy. It imports most of the energy that is consumed here from the rest of the country, and also internationally. We bring gas into the country, we bring in electricity from wind farms and power stations all over the place. So there's also a big implication here for energy networks. We're going to need to upgrade energy networks significantly. So for example, if lots and lots of people in one particular area want to have an electric car because that's a zero carbon option, that can quite quickly mean that we need to upgrade and reinforce that network in a particular area. There have already been examples in parts of London where I think one example was UPS wanted to electrify a lot of its vans and actually struggled to do that, partly because the electricity network infrastructure wasn't there, and they have managed to get around that initially. And that's another example where there's lots of jobs involved in actually doing that, investing in that infrastructure to bring about that change towards a low carbon economy. You asked about the circular part of it as well. I could see you emphasise that in your question. There are many jobs that can be created through that as well, through reuse, upcycling, and recycling. Those are all activities that keep materials that have been consumed here and do something useful with them and try and create some value from that. That can often be a source of job creation. On the flip side, a point I want to make is this transition to low carbon and circular can also destroy jobs at the same time, where there are activities that don't have a place anymore in that lower carbon circular economy. So for example, activities associated with high carbon fossil fuel industries, and there are jobs in London that are of that ilk as well. So you have to think both about the job creation but also the jobs that might be at risk from that transition.
Can I just say that I'm looking out of a window at some very high-rise buildings which are just the clearest demonstration of the delusion of relentless growth. My office was very close to the Shard, and I've watched a building go up next to the Shard, which was given planning permission, I'm assuming, by this institution. And I cannot believe the amount of water that needs to be pumped up to the top floors of those buildings, and the amount of energy that's going to be needed to pump that water up to the top floor of these buildings, right? This is delusional stuff. This is the delusion of eternal growth. It's not going to happen. So one of the first things London is going to do is going to change its planning policies. And in my view, to do that dramatically. And secondly, it's going to have to invest in infrastructure to make it possible for the circular economy to work. I watched in Brixton, where my family live, when the council introduced recycling. And outside big council blocks, people were diligently putting their plastics and their paper and sorting and stuff, and they did it almost immediately. You didn't have to put them through a university degree before they learned how to do that, right? So people adapt, but they need the infrastructure. Where is that to come from? That has to come from London's taxpayers, or because of the way in which you are financed, but it also has to come from government investment. And I agree very much with what Graham says, which is that we have to front-load investment to make it possible. And I want to give you an example of the way in which London did something very dramatic. I was around when the Mayor of London decided he was going to issue the Congestion Charge. It was deeply unpopular. All of his advisors, all of them lefties, said, you're going to be destroyed by this. You should not do it. On the day that he introduced the Congestion Charge, he also introduced 300 new buses to London. There was not a peep out of the people of London because they had been provided with an alternative. They had something else to use, so they therefore didn't whinge about the congestion charge. The congestion charge hasn't been introduced in other cities because that sort of front-loading of investment was not done. And the front-loading of investment has to be is big potatoes. To quote the guys and dolls guys, you know, it's big money, and that has to come from central government. So the thing you have to do is to demand that our politicians, you know, escape from their delusions and begin to mobilise the finance. Now, to mobilise the finance, the City of London is going to say, oh, well, we might lend you the money, but this is our price, right? And the price of borrowing for the government when it will need to borrow is not going to be determined by us, it's going to be determined by those people in the City of London. And the price will be high, and in my view, you know, if you look at what happened to British Steel was lent money by a private equity firm, and they said, we're going to charge you 9% for this. Within a year, British Steel was bust, right? That's the City of London, that's how it works. To extract 9% of a nation's assets, you know, to generate the income to repay that debt will be devastating for the ecosystem. So we're not in control of our financial system, and therefore to raise and mobilise the finance both for government but also for London is going to be very, very hard. So one of the really important things you're going to have to do is to argue, as others have done, that government really has to now begin to take seriously the role of mobilising the financing and investing in front-loading the economy to prepare us all for this.
I've seen Graham signalling, but I think I'm actually, and Simon, but I'm going to move on to the next group of questions with Caroline, and hold the thoughts that you were thinking of, and you may find a way to work them into Caroline's answers to Caroline. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm actually going to start with Simon, sort of speaking from a GLA perspective. We've heard the case and the importance and the urgency of transitioning to a low carbon circular economy. So, can you tell us what is London's current situation with regards to the transition to a low carbon and circular economy?
I think sort of initially sort of to think about it, we've spoken about it sort of a lot already. It's about a journey, and it's about sort of the economy sort of starting to transition sort of, and that's not just at a city level, that's at a global level. So that transition is starting to happen. And like sort of, but what we've all talked about here is sort of is there enough regulation and legislation, is there enough consumer demand, is there enough market demand that are driving those low carbon choices and those sort of environmentally friendly choices, those circular choices. And so, I mean, the fact that we are on that journey, and and it's a really important journey to be on, and one of the most important things for us to do is to sort of set the framework within which we're going to operate. So as part of that, we've sort of done a lot of work at looking at all the mayoral strategies and ensuring that those mayoral strategies have considered that transition to the low carbon economy and are supporting and promoting and facilitating that activity. So whether or not that's in the London Environment Strategy, where we set ambitious environmental targets, both for decarbonisation, for air quality, for wastes, for green infrastructure, or that driving demand for better quality activities, goods and services. In the economic development strategy, in that economic development strategy recognises the importance of the transition to the low carbon circular economy and the impact that it will have, and the support that it needs. So that's about supporting businesses, raising awareness and raising understanding of what that transition means, what it means for their business, what it means for the skills of the people within their business, what it means about the markets that they work in, the opportunities that there are for them to work in those markets, potentially to diversify into other markets, and awareness of the skills requirements. And we heard about it earlier, and it's a really fundamentally important point, is that just transition, ensuring that as we make this transition, there will be opportunities, but there will also be there'll be impacts on businesses where their businesses are difficult to deliver in a a lower carbon, more circular economy. If they can't make those changes so that they can adapt to that, then there needs to be an understanding that how can we support those businesses and those people to be able to move into that to make that transition. And then we heard a lot about the enabling infrastructure, and that's really fundamental. Not only are we trying to drive demand for the transition through the policies that we set, providing support so that the businesses understand what the market opportunities are and able to supply into that and compete in those markets. But it's about the enabling infrastructure. We heard it right here, whether that's an energy system that is smart, flexible, integrated, so that we're looking at power and heat, and we're working in a much smarter way about how we supply energy and how we reduce demand, so that gets picked up in the environment strategy. Also about waste infrastructure. We can't move to a circular economy if we don't have the waste management infrastructure to be able to support people to make those choices. And that's really important. It's something that Anne mentioned. I think if we want to make that transition, people will make that transition with us, but we need to provide them with the options, with the facilities, with the infrastructure that enables them to make those choices easily.
I mean, just picking up on on energy, do you think the Mayor is doing enough to really radically rethink energy supply? For instance, Transport for London only used 0.01% renewable energy. Now, the Mayor could be doing stuff around procurement. It's one of the biggest procurement opportunities, and TfL is one of the biggest users of electricity, and that is actually in the Mayor's control. So do you think that there should be more being done on procurement of energy?
We talk about the procurement generally actually around that transition, because the public sector has a great opportunity to drive demand and market opportunity through procurement. I think we're doing a lot already. The Mayor's doing a lot already. We set a very ambitious target around zero carbon by 2050. We've developed a range of programs around there. So we're looking at energy efficiency. We're looking at energy supply and what we can do around there. We're working very closely with Transport for London, developing a whole range of activities, reducing emissions from vehicles, and also looking at the emissions from running the organisation. We work very closely with them. So I think we're doing a real lot at the moment, in all the areas that we're doing. One thing that we do emphasise is the fact that we've only got an amount, and we've heard it here on the panel, an amount of influence over that decarbonisation strategy and that decarbonisation rate. But there'll be an amount of things that sort of need to be done at a national level, and sort of, or otherwise the devolution of powers and resources down to the mayor so that we're able to do
Yes,
more.
but I do think that in terms of, those, the mayor should be looking for those opportunities where actually there is quite a lot of control over, how that energy gets procured for TfL. That is absolutely in the mayor's, it is in his control. And the other thing that relates to that is the energy company, the Mayor's Energy for Londoners. Again, that could have been a fully licensed energy company, could have been using sort of reserves from TfL to kind of get really boost the procurement of renewable energy, but actually it went for a sort of license-like type arrangement. So, yes, it's just, are there other things that the mayor, those are two examples of things where the mayor could be actually doing more, and where the markets, as Anne had explained, the sort of the hampering of change and active movement forward being hampered by the City of London. Actually, those are areas where the mayor's got quite a lot of potential to actually take action himself.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, and the mayor is looking at all those options, and we work very closely with Transport for London to sort of look at how they're able to sort of decarbonise activities.
Okay.
Can I just come in there? I mean, Caroline just said that TfL uses 0.01% renewable energy.
Yep.
Do we have a target for increasing that? Because that is an incredibly low figure, and I slightly need to correct you, Caroline. TfL is actually the largest user of energy in London and has the largest electricity bill of any entity in London, £200 million a year. That's a lot. So why isn't, first of all, doing more to reduce the energy use, but secondly, shouldn't we be increasing that? Shouldn't we have a target for renewables?
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the environment strategy, sort of at the end, there is something, there's a chapter that looks at like sort of what the GLA family is doing and like sort of how we work across sort of all the GLA family. I don't know what the target is. I know there's an environment committee meeting.
Okay, so there is a target, so you could send that to us afterwards.
Yeah, I'll have a look and sort of see what that is.
That would be great. I have looked at the environment strategy quite a lot. Caroline, sorry.
Thank you. So, Simon, the further question is, do you think that the mayor's aims to become a low-carbon circular economy are actually achievable? And how much of the economy is currently low-carbon, and what support do you think is needed to realise the mayor's aims?
Yeah, well, I do think it's achievable. It's challenging. We've heard from everybody on the panel here that it's a challenging thing, and it's not something that can be done in isolation. We need support at a national level and at a sort of a global level. There needs to be a supportive economic system that sort of supports that transition. But equally, sort of, we need to be doing as much as we can, and we're sort of doing a lot around, we're doing an awful lot around that already, whether that's sort of setting ambitious targets, developing programs to support those targets within the sort of the powers that the mayor has, and also sort of supporting the wider economy. So as I mentioned, sort of the London plan sort of supports that transition, the economic development strategy supports that transition, and also the environment strategy, the transport strategy. Throughout sort of there, we're doing everything sort of we can within the sort of the mayor's powers to be able to support that transition. I mean, we also sort of undertaken a sort of a piece of work where we sort of look at what the value of the low carbon environmental goods and services sector sort of, and we've been doing that since sort of 2012 to sort of get an idea, and sort of we just published a report sort of in the summer, and sort of now sort of the value of those low carbon environmental goods and services in London is about sort of nearly £40 billion in value of sales, and the value of sales, and that sort of employs about sort of nearly 250,000 people, sort of in about sort of nearly 14,000 companies. So what that research does is sort of looks across all sectors, because it's something that we've picked up on here, that actually sort of that transition to a low carbon economy isn't just about sort of low carbon sectors. It's about all the economy, all sectors need to sort of reduce the environmental impact they have, the energy they use, and the sort of the natural resources they consume. And so that study looks across all sectors, and it looks across supply chains and things as well. It's a study that we've undertaken since, as I mentioned, 2012, and it shows that sort of over time that sector has continued to grow. So sort of back in sort of 2007-8, that sector was worth about £20 billion, £20.9 billion. Sort of now it's sort of worth nearly 40. So you can sort of see there's been a real increase in the amount of activity that has happened in there, and sort of hopefully that is a reflection of the fact that as we start moving toward people understand and markets sort of start to demand sort of more environmentally sensitive goods, lower carbon goods, more resource efficient goods, that market opportunity is there, and then that's getting sort of and that's growing. Sort of that sort of forms part of sort of the UK sort of wider sort of low carbon environmental goods and services. So London has sort of about a 21% of the UK share of the UK market, and sort of both the UK and the London sort of low carbon environmental goods and services has continued to increase over that time. And so that's a level of growth that's sort of far higher than sort of the wider economy.
I just want to pick up on something that Anne said earlier about the challenge when you have a market-driven way of moving towards change. So, for instance, electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the whole rollout of electric vehicles. From the point of view of public purpose, you would want electric vehicles to be focused on sort of business use, sort of essential community use, rather than simply replacing fossil fuels private cars with new electric private cars. And I just wonder if, given the way that the market is taking a lead on the rollout of, this is just one example of the low carbon economy, of electric vehicle infrastructure, that actually, do you find do you think that actually hampers the mayor's ability to kind of, to put public purpose at the forefront? We're still waiting sort of for the guidance from the mayor about where electric vehicle charging infrastructure should go, and we have a Wild West situation where private electric vehicle companies are taking over the footways for the purpose of selling electricity to private car owners, and that is, has huge implications for public purpose in our city. Our pavements being, literally just co-opted for selling electricity to private cars, and these private cars, which still take up space, cause congestion, cause road danger, and have, harms for the public good. So do you think that that the mayor needs to be doing more, and I'll open this up to everyone, but Simon first, to sort of challenge this, the market-driven move towards the the circular and low carbon economy?
I mean, I think the fact that some of the utilities are sort of privately owned sort of complicates sort of delivery of that, and we sort of heard from the panel on that. Sort of the mayor works very really hard, bringing together sort of a whole host of sort of stakeholders across the sector to sort of look at sort of EV charging, and sort of working with boroughs and sort of other stakeholders. He sort of set up a EV charging infrastructure partnership group to look at that and sort of help support that. So he's doing sort of an awful amount, a lot of that already, and sort of a lot of the work that mayor needs to do is sort of convening and bringing parties together. Sort of you might sort of see, and I mean we talked about sort of the energy infrastructure sort of in other countries in sort of Europe, and some of the cities sort of own their energy infrastructure and their water infrastructure. It makes it easier for them to make sort of decisions, and sort of, but in the UK where we sort of got more market driven, then it's important that we've got to sort of bring those stakeholders together and work together to be able to do that.
Thank you. Can I bring Anne in? I don't know if you would like to comment on, what the mayor could be doing differently to ensure that public purpose is at the heart of this transition.
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in the mayor's powers, but we've just had evidence of a fragmented and fractured system. And the mayor might be very filled with goodwill about doing this, but just simply herding these cats into one room and hoping they're going to work together is, in my view, aspirational, but really not achievable. So, I mean, the deep irony about the electric charging points is that I've watched private owners arrange for their own private charging unit here at home, and then not being able to travel 300 miles or 50 miles because there's no other charge. Your point about public purpose is that the private sector is, in a sense, tying itself up in all this, really, because they need to move around as well. And for that, they need public infrastructure. We've provided them with roads, we've provided them with railway lines, we've provided the private sector with enormous assets at taxpayer expense. The thing that really bugs me is the taxpayer never gets brought into this. I get fed up with the Taxpayers Alliance because we won't argue about the fact that this is we paid for this building, we paid for this land outside here to be laid out in the way that it is so that the private sector could move in and usurp it and take it over and extract rent from it. So I think, this is, the mayor could do a hell of a lot more than he does. He could be a lot stronger. He could be a lot more demanding. He could actually say that in exchange for all the assets that we, the public sector, provide to you, the private sector, these are the terms and conditions, and we don't do that. We're in awe of this private sector, so I worry about that. But can I say also that, even electric cars, in my view, are going to be finite in there. The fact is, we seem to forget that much as I am obsessed by and addicted to my iPhone, it is only put together by something that is called rare earths, by minerals that are called rare earths, and the clue is in the name. That all of the lithium and all of the minerals that we need for batteries are finite and limited. We're not going to be able to go on exploiting the Congo in order to be able to build more electric cars and more. This is delusional. And I want to move us on to another subject, which is that we're going to have to substitute labour for fossil fuels. We're going to have to do much more of all the work of moving around in London, for example, on our own 2 feet or on our own bicycles or in more sustainable ways.
That fits very well with the Mayor's transport strategy, which hopes to move everyone to 80% using public transport, bicycles and on foot. But I'm just going to reel you back in and come back to Caroline and her questions, because I think we are going to come back to labour and businesses and employees slightly later in our questions.
Right.
So Caroline.
Just one final...
I'm slightly lost as to which question you're reading.
Yeah, we're on the last one, which is how does London compare with other cities in transitioning to a low-carbon circular economy, and can there be any shared working or learning from other cities? Richard?
Well, partly to answer that one and the one before, London is making slower progress than the rest of the UK in reducing carbon emissions. So if you actually look at the data, the carbon emissions from London, or greenhouse gas emissions rather, I'd say it probably have fallen 25% since 1990 in London, and they've fallen 40% in the UK as a whole. So it's actually it's going less quickly than the rest of the UK is where we've got to thus far. And in the mayoral environmental strategy, it has a few different projections for what might happen going forward. None of those scenarios actually hit zero carbon by 2050, and some of them make quite steep reductions, but there's no actual plan to deliver net zero precisely as far as I can see. On the subject of, and how does London compare to other global cities? Difficult to say, but London is part of something, I think it's called the C40 Alliance, which is an alliance of global cities who are looking at sharing best practice and doing exactly that. On the subject of electric vehicles specifically, they're actually, this is actually an area where the Mayor of London and local authorities have a very big role to play. Yes, there are private sector actors involved in paying for the chargers to be installed and then selling electricity through them, and that's how this is the model of how this is going to work. But the local authorities and the mayor have a big stake in saying where those can be and should be rolled out and where they can't. So in some of the examples you were giving,
the guidance hasn't yet come out.
Yeah,
and
well,
we've been waiting
I know
for
there's
it for a
new
very
guidance
long
coming
time,
out, but
so,
local
yeah.
authorities have been essentially allocating bits of space and in some cases privatising local authority-owned car parking spaces for use for EV charging in quite a uncoordinated way, as far as I can see. So if there are examples of people putting in chargers in places that you think are undesirable, that's actually been allowed to happen by the local authority. Nobody can just go and build something without permission to do it. So a big part of this is actually about the local authorities and London Mayor working to identify where there should and shouldn't be EV chargers. There's actually an abundance of chargers. We have 25,000 public chargers in public spaces against 227,000 plug-in electric cars. So that's about one charger per 8 cars. That doesn't even include the ones that people have in their homes, which will be a very large number. So at the moment we actually have pump-primed the EV charging to a large extent. I don't think that is what is holding back EV uptake right now. It's actually quite hard to get. If you want to go and buy an EV, the thing that will prevent you right now is there's quite a long waiting list to buy some of the models. That's probably one of the things that is preventing people, and then the price of the car. That's the EV charging is actually not the problem right now, because the public sector has gone in and put lots of these things in already.
Yes, although EVs are not the solution to our transport system. We need to get people walking, cycling and using public transport, electric public transport.
I'm dragging you away from electric vehicles.
But yes, no, I know, I'm sorry, but I can never let an electric vehicle go.
An opportunity to discuss it, absolutely. However, I'm going to move on to Sean's question and Sean's questions, and Sean is going to start another group of questions which are about the challenges faced by the workforce and also the impact on businesses of making this transition to a low carbon and circular economy. So Sean.
Isabella, if I could start with you. How ready is London's business environment, economic, regulatory and demand to enable businesses to transition to our low carbon environment? Business models, to use low carbon business models in London for all the businesses that operate here?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment. There's growing awareness about the impact of the climate crisis. A poll by Greener UK and the Climate Coalition in June showed that nearly 70% of British people want urgent political action to tackle climate change, which is, a massive shift in terms of demand. So there is growing pressure, but I think there are fewer answers in terms of how this can actually be achieved. And I think if you ask consumers, employees, what do you think you can do to actually tackle this, there's still not a huge amount of awareness. So I think a lot can be done around that. In terms of regulatory, again, I think business-wise, a lot can be said about renewable energy and also in terms of energy efficiency. As we know, the current housing and building stocks in London are not very efficient. I think if we were to tackle that and people were to put upfront investment in that, that would have a huge, huge impact. Regulatory, the mayor has few powers to establish regulation. For example, in New York, they've imposed a ban on styrofoam, and it's small things like that that would be able to actually highlight to Londoners the small things that they can do in terms of circular economy. I do think in terms of waste we need to do a huge amount, and I think educating as well is going to have a massive impact. We saw that the UK government have legislated for net zero. That didn't have a single opposition in the House of Commons or in the Lords. That versus the Climate Change Act, when that went through Parliament, a number of MPs opposed that. I don't think a lot of Londoners now would oppose the fact that we are transitioning to net zero, but I don't think anybody actually realises what that's going to mean for them in terms of what that means for their boilers, what that means in terms of getting rid of their car. all of these issues. And I actually think that in terms of everybody being prepared for this, we need to do a huge amount in terms of educating people in terms of the reality of what this means. And I think that the Mayor's office have got a massive responsibility in bringing everybody towards this. I mean, you ask, whether us achieving net zero in London is achievable. It won't be unless we educate people. And I think there needs to be mass public awareness about the individual impacts that people have. And whether that's advertising or, on TfL networks, I think we need to do a mass awareness raising. And I actually think that having been on various London Assembly City Hall websites, you have got sections around what it means for net zero. I think that needs to be bolstered significantly. I think the UK government should do the same. And I think that there should be a lot more partnerships with businesses about how they are trying to reach net zero.
Richard, a similar question to you, and try to weave in what businesses are doing from a business model point of view, because the Moncler sort of people, planet, profit in that order, how is that going to be acted out in reality? London has many businesses, from florists who need to drive around to international banks whose footprint is the enormous building they build. We are going to have these things, but how can they be done better, more efficiently, more planet-friendly?
Yeah, I suppose I do see examples similar to Isabella's response, which is I think there's a mixed bag here. So there are examples of businesses adapting, making new business models that are part of this transition. There are also lots of businesses and individuals who are totally unaware of what living in a low-carbon circular economy means or means for them. So one example of activity which is sort of consistent with this idea, if you think about heating as a challenge, heating will be a big challenge. How do we heat our homes and buildings in a low-carbon way? That's actually a really difficult challenge because most of our heating in London, in the UK as a whole, is done using gas. So I don't think London has a clear answer to this at all, but there are people innovating in that space and looking at potential alternatives. One example being, I went to visit previously a heat network scheme in London, actually not very far from here, where a company, a utility, is putting in a heat network, and that means it's actually piping around hot water to buildings, and that can take heat from a number of different sources, including waste heat from industrial processes, including still gas-based heating, but also other low-carbon sources like air source heat pumps and so on. So they have found a business model that is providing cheap heat to Londoners. It is future-proof to the extent you can plug in more low-carbon heat sources into it in the future. And they're doing that. They're making that investment. It was actually a very expensive scheme to do. But that's one very, very small example in one tiny bit of London just over there. How on earth, London actually needs a plan for how you roll out that kind of activity across a whole city. How do you heat a whole city in a low-carbon way? I don't think there is a plan for that in London unless I've missed it. But that's the kind of change that you seriously need to think about if you want homes, businesses, to be adapting to this reality, this target. That's the kind of thing you need to think through as the London Assembly, as the Mayor of London, as local authorities as well. That's a pretty tough challenge. I don't think there is a plan.
Could I just sort of add, I think, to that, the fact that if you look in the environment strategy, sort of recognise obviously sort of decarbonisation of heat is one of the most important aspects of getting to sort of zero carbon, and so we've got a range of programmes that are sort of looking to sort of address that. So sort of whether or not that's energy efficiency, we've got energy efficiency programmes that look at both public sector and residential sector. We've got like sort of programmes that look at sort of fuel poverty. We've also got programmes that look at sort of energy supply, recognising we need to sort of decarbonise.
Simon, I see that, but my focus, and maybe Anne wants to make a contribution, is about business models. Because ultimately, if you go back to Isabella's point about education, ultimately most people will get involved in this conversation when it costs them.
Yep.
And they won't be paying for things that they don't understand. So business and public sector are going to have to find ways of A, telling the story, and B, it has to be economically viable. And this is where I would Anne's comments, because Anne has a slightly different perspective, I suspect, on on what are the business practices, the business models that we will have to instigate to make this possible. If you just take the challenge of heat, London is vast. All the other places we're comparing to in the world are simply not as large as London, and they don't have the variety of layout. So Anne made a comment about the huge business buildings over there, but if you go further out into London, you're looking at the suburbs. How do we heat these places, and how do we pay for it? That's the challenge here. What's the business models that will take London forward?
So,
Yeah, please, Anne, please.
Oh, well, I mean, I just want to say that I don't know what the business model is for that. But what I do know is that the current business model is to automate and robotify, and as far as possible, to shed workers. And by doing that, they're actually using more energy. You know, if you go into a supermarket, you're confronted by a load of machines. I actually had the awful experience of walking into a hotel and being confronted by machines in the wall that registered my arrival. You know, we're now into a position where the business model is to shed the workforce and to automate, robotify, and use algorithms for marketing. That's where they're investing. That's where the money is going. And if we want to move it from that into, you know, low carbon energy, well, then it's going to take a certain amount of direction, both by government but also by the city. And I don't see that coming forward. You know, I see the government saying nothing to do with me, Gov, you know, if employers want to do it. And I was really struck looking at the data on numbers of employed people here in London, that last year, for the first time, 24,000 jobs were lost in professional, scientific and technical activities. You know, in order to retrofit our housing to make them more, and our properties, to make these buildings more energy efficient and less reliant on energy, we're going to need a labour-intensive workforce, basically, and it's going to have to be highly skilled and highly trained and educated. But as far as business is concerned, the business model is not to do any of that. It's instead to replace those people with machines. Well, and there's a limit to what that can have, what they can do.
We will come on to that area because the mayor has now had some of the skills budget devolved to him. So we're going to talk a bit about the skills that are needed to develop the low carbon and circular economy. But I've seen that Isabella and Graham would also like to come back to Sean on the points he was just making about.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with everything that you said. I mean, I actually think that business models have a huge impact. I mean, just look at the massive businesses behind us. If you look at the green economy and everything that we're actually trying to shift towards, you look at the thousands of people that these businesses hire. Actually, if you start a massive shift within them, they will have a huge impact. If they all shifted to 100% renewable energy, if they said within their own businesses, their own procurement, that they were not going to use non-recyclable packaging and that they were going to offer everyone cycle schemes so that they could buy bikes. You look at modal shifts that the massive retailers are using at the moment in terms of things like electric cargo bikes rather than using big diesel vans that are used for online deliveries. I mean, those are so much more efficient in terms of costs, but also energy efficiency. I think there's a huge shift going on, and I think that actually businesses are really engaged. They also know that employees want to work for socially responsible and environmentally responsible employers, and I think we are seeing a massive shift in that. And you know, massive businesses being ranked alongside their competitors in terms of how environmental they are, that really matters to them. And I think we need to push that, and I think we need to highlight all of the good work that they do, because that filters down to the SMEs, which is the real shift we also need to have as well.
Thank you. Graham, you wanted to come in.
Just on Sean's point about the business model, I suppose it's where you try and get the balance between the public approach as against the free market. And I mean, my view, probably won't be surprised to know, is that the free market hasn't really delivered. I mean, there's been a reference to the cuts in greenhouse emissions that we've experienced. and made the point about a lot of that has been as a result of the outsourcing of the manufacturing sector in this country. And apart from anything else, also the fact that it's pretty much flatlining now. You know, the Committee on Climate Change recent report is very concerned that we're not going to meet the upcoming carbon budgets because of that. And so therefore I think we do need a radical look if we are convinced that the need to actually meet our legal targets under the Climate Change Act, then we do actually have to look at a model which is going to give a much bigger role to the public sector. And that's where I think, you know, things like we talked about procurement. My understanding is the Mayor's got something like an £11 billion procurement programme. That could be used in an incredibly powerful way to try and influence what's done to the supply chain through that programme and what those companies are doing in terms of delivering around the Mayor's objectives when it comes to the LCCE. So that's clearly one opportunity. I mean, Caroline's mentioned transport. I don't want to go into the detail of that again, but you know, I echo the points that have been made. That just simply transitioning from fossil fuel cars to electric vehicles is not going to be the answer. It won't deal with some elements of pollution. It certainly won't deal with congestion. There needs to be a huge increase in public affordable transport. And unless that's done, we're not going to get to grips with the congestion crisis and the pollution crisis in the capital. So there's that. But just one other area which is actually crucial to all this is not the be all and end all, but energy. That's both energy efficiency and energy generation, distribution and supply. That is crying out for more public engagement in terms of the way that that's actually operated. You know, you've only got to look back at the miserable failure of the Green Deal, which is basically an employer/consumer-led approach. That was a complete disaster. The free market, if you look at it, has not really delivered at the level of ambition that we're going to need if we're actually going to achieve these targets. And just a final point, I mean, I've come back from Brighton today where the CUC Congress has been meeting, and there's a motion this afternoon which hopefully will get passed, which is looking at this issue of just transition, which is for me, you know, what lies at the heart, or should lie at the heart of Sean's business model, and that you know, you just mentioned as well, that social responsibility. And I think if the Mayor was going to take a lead on that subject, then there would be a real opportunity. For example, one of the demands in this motion is for regional authorities, including London as well as the UK nationally, to establish a Just Transition Commission, bringing employers and trade unions together. It's already been adopted in Scotland, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But it's certainly one way of implementing our international agreements, because we have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement clearly talks about the need for a just transition, where workers who are going to be impacted by this, both in potentially a positive way, but as you've indicated also in sometimes in a negative way in terms of job loss and quality of terms and conditions, that kind of commission would really be something, again, to take as a model where London could try and show to other regional authorities that they are interested in and concerned with the role of workers, and not just simply a business model where, unfortunately, I have to say, even in GLA, most of the structures and organisations that have been set up are populated by businesses and employers. Now, obviously you need those on board, but you do need a worker voice, and if we're talking about social justice, then for me, trade unions represent, along with community organisations, one element of that social justice force.
I'm going to come back to Sean because he's got a further question. Simon, there will be an opportunity to bring you in again in a minute. Sean.
Just to sum all this up as a question, maybe I'll start with Richard. So, what are the economic considerations for businesses in London around this transition piece, around investment in the workforce, investment in technologies? What should the Mayor be doing? Surely, because I hear our need to be more environmentally friendly, and I see the costs of a business, but they're not always a million miles apart if we're talking about efficiency. Surely if I'm lowering my carbon footprint, I'm also lowering my cost base. So I should be trying to build a business model and an investment model that suits that. So what other considerations are there to support the workforce, and just what can businesses actually do in their here and now around promoting their own business model, changing it?
Pretty broad question, but I think what I do see is that businesses are in some areas leading the way anyway already. So Isabella highlighted one thing, which is one example is many large companies making commitments to be lower carbon in their operations. There are many companies who have signed up to something called the RE100 campaign, which basically says, I'm going to procure only green energy either now or at some point in the future. And those companies are doing that generally for corporate social responsibility reasons. They're sometimes doing it because they also think it's low cost. So if you go and directly procure green energy, as we were talking about TfL could do, that can be green and cheap. And so there are examples of companies doing that. There are examples of public bodies doing that. The mayor could, if TfL's not doing that, that would seem like a sort of blindingly obvious thing for TfL to go and do and lead the way. If it's procuring that much energy, then TfL itself could go and procure greener energy, and the mayor could make a stand on that and basically say, can other London businesses follow? And I think you'd be amazed at the power that kind of thing could have, the positioning of London saying we will procure greener energy as part of the transition. That could be an important thing. I think it's only one small step. You made a question about efficiency. Is investing in energy efficiency also something about improving profitability? Though, again, there's an overlapping circle there where if you can encourage businesses to invest in their buildings, their efficiency, that drives down cost. In all fairness, London is doing that. There are two programmes called Refit and Renew which do exactly that. The mayor could put a lot more money into those programmes. I think they've been relatively small scale, but the mayor could allocate more funds to help businesses get them over the line with these sorts of projects to improve their own efficiency. So there's a couple of examples there already of where the mayor could do some things, and through TfL and through these energy efficiency programmes to drive things forward with business and help them adapt.
Mm-hmm. And let me just pose this to you. What more could we be doing to improve the situation for workers? Because as Graham rightly said, a change in the market means a change in employment market as well.
Yeah.
It strikes me that we have to have a market before we can train people to work in that market. So therefore, we need an investment model that's saying we are trying to transition away. Is any of that work being done? Does the mayor need to do that work?
So I'm not close enough to that, but I think I think Lane, you said that the mayor has now has control of some skills budget, and I think that is where some thinking could be done. So try and understand as the Assembly, as the London Mayor, try and understand what are the jobs that are likely to be created through this transition, and where are there areas where jobs may be at risk. And if you can understand that, then investing in training and to help people change their careers towards areas where there are likely to be jobs in the future, you could help them make that transition. So one example could be, I highlighted it earlier, we will need to invest a lot in improving the efficiency of our buildings. So we probably need a lot more people who fit insulation and higher efficiency heating appliances. So skilled work, there may be a shortage of those. I have no idea of the numbers, but there may be a shortage of people who actually have those skills in London. And therefore, but there's an opportunity that's opening up for there to be more jobs in that area. So through intelligent use of the skills budget, you could actually help people prepare themselves for those jobs of the future. We're going to need more people in that space, more people having jobs associated with electricity networks, gas networks, energy efficiency, EV chargers. All these things are areas where you're likely to see a growth in jobs. Well, let's help people prepare themselves for that transition through skills retraining.
Just as Graham neatly brought us back to Sean's question that he was just asking, Richard is now neatly bringing us on to Onka's question, so I'm going to move straight on to Onka, who's going to now ask some questions about skills.
I think, Richard, you probably already answered it, but let me ask this question of Graham, right? We know there are skills shortages, for example, in construction. Are there any other organisations which are experiencing skills shortages? And and how will this economy be affected by the skills shortages?
Yes, I think it's pretty much across the board, and I suppose it depends on how you see the development of low carbon circular economy skills, because you mentioned construction, and of course that's an obvious area where people do look, and clearly there are huge shortages in relation to, if you're looking at energy efficiency and the implementation of renewable energy standards across new builds, then that's actually something where that's clearly got to be addressed. But I think the point I'd also make is that we're just not looking at hard skills in terms of how you install an ground air source heat pump or something like that, but also the soft skills, and I think that's really going to be important for apprenticeship policy, but then even right up through training the existing workforce. And I suppose we've at various stages pointed over there to the city and the rest of it. That's a classic example. The IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management Association, brought out a report recently which highlighted the lack of skills in terms of an understanding of low carbon economy right across the workforces, and particularly in the financial sector. In fact, it was the financial sector that figured most highly. Around 89% of the staff in the financial industry couldn't really make a positive contribution, or only partly, around the development of a low-carbon strategy for their particular institution or company. Now, that's quite a damning statistic, and I think what it tells me is that we need to be making sure that we're threading education for sustainable development, climate awareness, right throughout the training programme of a whole range of occupations and professions. So it's not just the more obvious ones in relation to construction, as we've said, but right through the way that business management courses are run, in terms of ensuring that project managers really understand the impact of any developments that they're going to be involved in. And the list is endless, basically. And that's where, again, going back, I suppose, to this kind of private or more publicly controlled part of the discussion, that's why, for me, things like a national education service are so crucial, because I don't think we can rely on employers just by themselves delivering these programs through the current apprenticeship model or even training models. But a national education service should have this education for sustainable development at its heart, and making sure that it's looked at, from all levels, level 1 right through to level 7, 8 and 9, in terms of how you're going to deliver around this particular aspect of skills.
Thank you, Graham. Simon, you've heard this, that there are a lot of areas which are of concern. Has the Mayor had any conversations with people about this?
Yes, the Mayor has, and as you know, we've got a second panel session sort of afterwards, and sort of got a colleague who'll be sort of able to sort of talk to you more about the sort of the skills elements, but sort of it's absolutely sort of essential that the workforce has the skills and the understanding to be able to sort of implement the transition, as we sort of said, and that is a skills base across all sectors, because sort of every sector has to be able to understand what its environmental impacts are and to be able to adapt its activities and its business models accordingly, so that it's able to sort of mitigate the impacts that it has within its sector. And if each sector does that, then we make that transition towards a low carbon sort of circular economy. We'll also have specific sectors that sort of like clean tech sectors, where you've sort of got technologies and approaches that are being sort of sold into other sectors to support them to reduce their carbon emissions, to reduce their energy consumption, to reduce their resource consumption and things like that. So between those two sort of sectors, like right across all sectors, and then specific sectors within the economy as well. So you need to have those skills so that those organisations are able to do that. I just think, sort of just picking quickly up on the business models aspects, and we've got sort of a number of programs just using energy efficiency and sort of energy supply as an example, where sort of developing programs that are sort of trying to, that are developing sort of business models for sort of large-scale deployment and delivery. We need to deliver activity sort of fast and sort of at a large scale across London to be able to meet our targets. But sort of one of the problems that you sort of see is, and we've spoken about it sort of a lot at the beginning, is the regulatory framework. So sort of trying to make low carbon decisions within a national regulatory framework that doesn't necessarily favour low carbon decisions sort of makes it sort of difficult to make those choices. Whereas if you had a sort of a regulatory framework that sort of supported low carbon choices, then like sort of the business models become much simpler because it's financially advantageous to make those decisions ahead of sort of higher carbon decisions as well. So we need to sort of look at how we can sort of lobby central government, what central government can do around policy and around regulation to drive that. Just look at something like the feed-in tariff and sort of the role that it played in sort of driving business models around sort of PV.
What kind of support could the mayor give to help the employers and the employees make those transitions?
Are you asking
Yeah,
me?
you will. Yes.
Well, I doubt that within the mayor's budget it's possible for us to address the shortage of skills and the absence of skills. I speak as someone who, back in the day, headed up the leader's office of the Inner London Education Authority.
That's a good place.
And I watched as we systematically closed down, shrank, and starved our further education institutions of resources and outsourced effectively our education system. So, you know, I think we've been rendered powerless, and that's not accidental. And the Mayor of London and the institutions of London have been rendered irrelevant to that process. So I think it's pretty dismal outlook, really. But you know, the government could change that. It could decide that it wants authorities like the City of London to invest, the London Assembly to invest in skills and provide the resources for that. But we lack the institutions, we lack the skills, we probably lack the teachers and the, you know, and what, because we've taken the view that actually we could outsource it all to China. Let China invest in all those skills and we'll just buy Chinese Chinese workers, or buy Chinese goods and services, or the Bangladeshis, or, you know, South African nurses. Let the South African government train the nurses and we'll just buy them cheaply from them. So that approach to skilling our own people has really denuded our skills base, and it's one of the big threats that we face, in my view.
We know that, I mean, I understand that we know the threat, but what can we do about it? It's just recognize the threat isn't enough, right? It's how do we respond to the threat?
Well, when I think about the institutions that we had in place under the Inner London Education Authority, it's a daunting task. You've got to rebuild those institutions. You've got to rehire those teachers and those skilled people, and you've got to pay them salaries, really. And now I think it's entirely affordable. I think we could do it. It's very easily done. But it takes, the government's political will and then the powers of the London Assembly. And I doubt the London Assembly has either sufficient powers or resources to rebuild the skills that have been lost. I'm sorry to be so drearily pessimistic about it all.
I can see Isabella's keen to
Isabella,
comment as well.
Yeah,
Maybe on a positive note.
Yeah.
I think so, yeah. The Mayor has an unparalleled ability to convene multiple stakeholders, and I think without having to put in a huge amount of investment, actually convening people is hugely effective. I've got two examples here. Malmo, I've got 100 companies that were invested to inform the development of their fossil-free 2030 roadmap, and that was contractors, banks, suppliers and construction companies, and they then made this really synchronized thinking circular economy plan that was led by business, which is the most effective way to actually implement change. I think the other really good one in terms of the circular economy
Can I just clarify, was that led by business, or was there some involvement from the City of Malmo's government
doing the sort of convening
to actually
role.
convene them, yes.
Yeah, so that you were referring to at the beginning.
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
I believe. The London Waste and Recycling Board, as I'm sure you know, has established a circular business support programme to support SMEs, and they have a huge impact in our waste in London. So I think there are lots of ways that we could actually do this. I also think, let's take London Climate Action Week. That was a really great example of what the Mayor can actually do. Let's make it bigger in terms of, I actually asked quite a lot of people in this sector what they thought about that, and they thought absolutely brilliant. You ask your friends who aren't, you feel like maybe we're in a slight echo chamber in that instance. We can really bolster that. We're about to potentially host COP26. I know sadly it's not going to be here, but there's a huge amount that the Mayor can do leading up. We have a year now to plan something absolutely brilliant, and for the Mayor to really try to convene that. As Richard says, there's no real plan in terms of heat. That could be something that, could actually be convened. So, yeah, I will actually just say as well, there's a huge amount in terms of communications that can be done, that the Mayor can do. He has a lot of ability to get press coverage, and I actually think that you combine that with the fact that businesses who are doing very well in this field want the same. You could, push them to try to highlight more about what they're actually doing by convening London's best businesses, and leading up to the mayoral campaign. There's a huge amount then in terms of what the mayor's actually done over the past few years, and what the next mayor intends to then do. That's a hugely powerful platform in terms of highlighting this, and I think we should make the most of that.
Well, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel. I am going to draw this part of the meeting to a close. We didn't invite you along today because we thought you were all going to agree with each other. We were expecting you to provide us with provocative responses to our questions, and I think you have come at this from different perspectives, but I do have one strong takeaway where you all seem to be very agreed, which is about the need for really improving communication. Although there seems to be a lot of public awareness of the concept of a climate emergency and the need to respond quickly, which you all also agreed on as well, there doesn't as yet seem to be sufficient communication or understanding by the public in London, or indeed possibly anywhere else, but I'm just focusing on London, about what is actually needed to be done to respond to the climate emergency in terms of businesses and workforce and generally in our lives. And I think although you expressed that in very different views, I think that was something that was very common. I think Anne probably had the strongest expression of it, and we know we can do it. We run large programmes, but when we responded during the war, we all as one moved in a very different direction, and people accepted a massive change of moving to work on the land when they'd been doing something else, being evacuated, rationing, a whole series of big changes. And we're not really in that place. We haven't communicated that yet, was what I took from you all, although that was perhaps the most strong version of that statement. So can I thank you all now? And I'm going to bang the gavel because we're now going to move over to bring in some other panellists. So we're going to have a short break in the transmission on the webcast. Or we're not. I don't know whether it actually continues. It should break.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff.
You can do, but I think that it's how you minimise the economic impacts as you move over. finish by 12 or 12:30 anyway. We find that these elections all sorts of frustrating. You can do that. I hope so, yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on to our second panel, and we're going to continue discussing the move forward to the low carbon and circular economy and the future jobs and skills that we would need for that, so both the transition and when we arrive there. And I'd like to welcome Graham Petersen, who has stayed with us for the second panel, but I'd also now like to welcome Bevan Jones, who is with us this morning as well now. And Bevan is a freelance consultant on climate and sustainability. Welcome, Bevan, and also has a bit of history at Sustainable Homes, as do I. And Laura Dubeck, who is here in the building as the Senior Manager, Programme Delivery East and South on Skills and Employment. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're now going to move on to some questions from Fiona.
Thank you, Chair. The first question is about the new occupations and skills that are likely to be required in a low-carbon circular economy. So I just wondered whether members of the panel could comment on that. And I'll start with Laura.
Yeah, so we are in the process of learning and understanding the skills and occupation requirements of the low-carbon circular economy. I mean, it's fair to say that based on our access to information and data at the moment, the picture is very patchy. So we are putting in place a number of initiatives to ensure that we have greater access to information to inform our policy thinking, partly to inform our approach to funding skills through the adult education budget. So one of the things that we are doing is funding a specific policy role within our team, which will have a clear responsibility and objectives around understanding jobs and skills requirements of the low carbon circular economy. We are also using the access to data that we do have to gain a better understanding. So there is some research underway. You may or may not have heard of the individual learner record, but this is a database that we now have access to as a result of devolution of the adult education budget, which is a wealth of data on the qualifications that are being delivered and undertaken in London. As you can imagine, it's quite a complex data piece, and part of the work happening at the moment is putting in place the systems that we need to actually understand and analyse that data, and that's all part of the approach that we've taken to implementing and getting ready to deliver the adult education budget. As some of the discussions have suggested on the previous panel, there are and will be particular occupations related to the future economy needs, but there are also the softer skills, but also the tasks, if you like, that will be required in relation to a range of jobs related to various sectors. So again, there is a challenge for us in starting to understand what that looks like. What we do know.
Sorry, have you got a time frame for establishing what that looks like? Because I think the specific question was around what new occupations or skills were likely to be required. Do you have a time frame for when you would establish that?
So we are in the next 6 months developing systems to undertake analysis of data on current provision. There will, in the course of the next year or so, be research undertaken into future skills needs. So we're not quite at that stage just yet. What we do know is that digital skills is going to be front and centre to all of this, and the Mayor has programmes around ensuring that there is a talent pipeline with the digital skills that would be required for a low carbon economy. There's also a future statutory entitlement for digital skills that will be in place. So the adult education budget will ensure from the academic year 2020-21 onwards that everyone has access to a minimum digital skill level. There was also some discussion about particular qualifications related to the needs of a low carbon circular economy. We are at the moment, the central government will be undertaking a review of post-16 qualifications in the future, and a consultation was responded to by the Mayor earlier this year to make it clear that the Mayor expects to have a role in developing new qualifications to ensure that they meet the needs of London's future economy.
Great, thank you very much. Bevan, could you comment on what new occupations or skills are likely to be required in a low carbon circular economy, please?
Yeah, good morning. Looking at this question, I think that there are some, this isn't comprehensive by any stretch, but there are some key sectors which either exist or which are going to develop over the next 20 years in relation to mitigating and adapting to climate change. And sectors is kind of a loose term here. So electrification, that's one of the kind of key areas. Carbon accounting, which kind of exists, stroke doesn't exist as a real profession at the minute. Climate risk assessment, the energy industry, and I separate that from electrification because of the diversification that's needed in terms of energy supply. So you might be looking at things like biomass and different energy generation techniques, so that's why energy and electrification are separated. Finance, I think that's already been mentioned in the previous session, and built environment, stroke urban planning. So, and I've outlined those sectors just because there is a big risk to getting things wrong in those sectors as they exist. We've already heard about what some of the issues in the finance sector and the way that in how climate change, carbon management is accounted for in that sector. We have seen some huge mistakes within the built environment and the urban planning area in terms of skills, in terms of implementation, things like that. We see that already. So those are the sectors. In terms of the skills and occupations, again, I feel like I'm stealing from the previous session. I had put change management skills, i.e. those soft skills. That's going to be a huge soft part of a professional's skill set. When I've gone into businesses or worked with businesses in terms of either getting them to adapt to climate change or their mitigation policies, it's a change management exercise because you are working with either executive leaders or board members who've been doing what they've been doing for 20, 30 years. And they've been doing it in a way which has been successful for them over that period. We're now entering a different type of world where those traditional approaches might need modification or they might need a change of mindset. So we are going to need people who have change management skills. That's one thing. Carbon accounting. So I've mentioned that as a sector, but also it's a skill. And every person who wants to work in finance should be doing parallel carbon accounting skills with that. Who are the people who we work with every day who are the best with numbers? It's our finance directorates. Those are the areas where that should be. So I've been having discussions with my son who wants to go into working in finance. And I've said to him, well, this is the kind of stuff you're going to need alongside your traditional maths skills, your data management skills. And so carbon accounting is something which needs to be standard. I've mentioned just briefly data management. Data management, manipulation and exploitation skills are going to be huge, because as we move into a more digitised, more smart world, people are now presented with information overloads. There was a really interesting article in The Guardian a couple of weeks back. Information overloads. We just don't know how to process this information in our daily lives. So when we step into our professional lives, how do we collate, how do we analyse, how do we implement data that we are currently collecting in businesses and organisations? So that's one thing. That leads on to modelling. We're going to need people with modelling skills. And that's data modelling in terms of business and their kind of everyday jobs. Supply chain and logistics management is going to be huge. There is a huge kind of carbon risk within our supply chains which hasn't yet been tackled. The conversations I've had with a few businesses in the last few months, I've looked through at least 50 corporate reports from big high street retailers in the UK in the last few weeks. There seems to be this lack of engagement in supply chain carbon. And I think that's partly because you need to outsource those skills, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get into that. So I think that's one of the areas. Interpreting climate science, I think, is going to be key. Because, again, I go and talk to businesses. I can have conversations now, as opposed to 6, 7, 8 years ago, with people, and they know what carbon footprint is. They know what solar panels do. They know that they need to have targets and report on these. They know these conversations are being had, and they're easy to have. When I then say, well, actually tell me about the impact of climate or extreme weather events on your business's bottom line or your organisation's capacity to deliver its services, no one can tell me. And that partly goes back to the way that data is collected and the data that people traditionally look at. So we need people, whether it is a board member with responsibility. We even have oil companies with board members with a responsibility for climate science now. That needs to be something which is standard. The ability to interpret climate science and not just leaving it to specialist scientists is going to be vital for people leading a FTSE 100 company all the way down to a local printing shop in the East End. So that's, I think, where I finish. Yeah.
Fiona, I can see that Graham is keen to come in. Do you want to?
Yes, but I did have I am going to go through the questions. I'm going to bring everybody in, but
Okay.
I did have a follow-up question for Bevan, if that's okay, Chair. I was going to ask, obviously you've had the conversation with your son, sort of encouraging him to sort of pick up these things. Is there any evidence that careers services in schools or that curricula in schools are picking up the similar sort of future needs that that you've identified and you've actually had the opportunity to talk to with your own son?
I think they are very slowly. I learned about global warming, as it used to be called, in A-level geography back in 1998. That was my first, and then obviously I went through education and did all that. From the conversations I'm able to have with my son, he's 12 years old, he is able to articulate climate risk to me and tell me what he thinks climate risk is. He's also able to articulate certain things around this is what people need to do, or is this what people need to do. So I feel like it's getting there, and I feel like it's gone beyond GCSE geography. I feel like that there is an element of that there are those discussions happening at school. I think there was an earlier point around, but what about the teaching of those? Is the teaching kind of academically rigorous enough for that person to then go off into university, college, higher education, further education, whatever, to then be able to rigorously apply that to whatever area they want to go into? My son is good at maths. He wants to probably work in finance. So that's where he's talking to me a lot about these things at the minute. I think they've obviously been talking about it at school. So how does his professional interest in finance tally with his other interest in climate risk and climate change, and can he combine the two? I think that's where the issue is. If he goes off and does an accounting course, or he goes to college or whatever he wants to do, is there engagement with that at that level? And is there a practical application to what he's going to be doing in an office for the next 20, 30, 40 years of his life? Okay. I'm not sure there is. I guest lecture sometimes at some universities on some courses. Bearing in mind people go to university 3 or 4 years, I am the only person who will come in for 2 hours in that 4-year period to talk to them about climate change and their course and the implications for their professional career. So that just isn't enough.
Yeah.
And I think it is a challenge for people who work in education, people who work in skills, for employers, and people who are buying education now, people who have to pay for their education. I think it's a really important thing for them to be able to assess whether or not they can get those topics and integrate them properly with the topic that they have an interest in, that they perhaps want to develop a career in.
Thank you. And moving to Graham, the starting question was around what new occupations and or skills are like to be required in a low carbon circular economy. So your thoughts on that would be very welcome as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Going back to that, I think, this point about a piecemeal approach isn't going to work, and what you're talking about, this needs to be standardised, isn't it, across the whole of the education sector, but also with employers as well. So just looking at it in a structured way and linking back to the previous discussion that we had, every employer should be obviously measuring their carbon footprint, their greenhouse gas emissions. And then once they've done that, they actually need to have a carbon reduction plan put in place, which should be done in consultation with the workforce. As part of that, what's needed is to look at, what you're going to do, how you're going to achieve it, and what are the implications for that in terms of future jobs, both job loss and job gain, and the skills in order for your workforce to be able to help you to deliver it as an employer. And that's not happening. It's happening in a few places, but it's not happening, that's not the norm. And that's what's really needed if employers and businesses are going to step up to the plate in terms of supporting the Mayor's ambitions for London to be carbon neutral. So that would be, my starting point on that. I mean, in terms of the the contribution that the education sector can make towards that, it's very difficult at the moment. I mean, the point's been made about FE. I mean, my whole career has been largely in the FE sector, and it's just such a tragedy. I'll even go as far as to say that what's happened to the funding in the sector and their ability to be able to deliver around this.
The specific question is about the skills that are required. If you could focus on that, so thanks.
Yeah, well, I think I did probably touch on that. So in the previous one about the need for both the soft and the hard skills to be clearly covered. But what that means, you see, is the need for the GLA and employers to be looking at the relationship around the awarding bodies, in terms of what's currently available and how far. I mean, I was a member of the Green Economy Council's Skills Task Force when it was set up back in 2010, and then it was disbanded. And the job of that task force was to actually inform government departments about what were the skills that were needed and what were the qualifications that should be put in place. That body, as I say, was dismantled. And so what we've got is we've got an industrial strategy and a clean growth strategy and sector strategies that don't really develop this at all. There's no clear indication of where the kind of skills strategy sits alongside those policy positions. And so for me, that's what's absolutely crucial. And just to bring it back to the GLA, we put in a submission to the skills strategy for London. And one of the points we made was that, in fact, it just talks about the low carbon economy sector as the focus. That's the only reference to low carbon economy, just in terms of the sector organisations that are actually delivering around that fairly narrow area. So what my point would be about the need to bring that out, broaden that out into the whole of the economy, and not just look at it in terms of low carbon services and environmental services, which is what it currently says.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, I wonder if I can ask Bevan how we can encourage employers to invest in the skills required for transition, and maybe also what support do they need to help the transition.
Well, I think there are two things that really focus employers' minds in any major topic area, but especially in this one. There's two. So, regulation. So that's just a clear regulatory path. I think people who work in it are starting to see that regulatory path, especially in the UK. We're heading to a net zero economy. People have declared climate emergencies, and they're starting to develop plans for those. I'm involved in some of that work, and there is a clear regulatory path. We're going to have a new housing standard in 2025. So we're starting to see that. So one thing is regulation. How do I direct my workforce to then make sure that I am compliant? So compliant is the lowest hanging of all the fruit, really, and kind of I'm compliant, great, but I need the skills to get there. So that regulatory pathway, that regulatory signalling is one of the number one things, because I know a new standard is coming in 2 or 3 years' time. I can then make sure that I get some advice, or I do it myself in terms of getting my workforce ready for that. The other one is direct experience or impact of climate issues. I think that's beyond obviously the London Mayor's control, but that is one of the big motivators for get people to take action. I think we've started to see what the figure is now. 85% of people in the UK are now very concerned about climate change, the highest figure it's ever been. Why is that the case? Well, we've had 2 extremely hot summers beyond the realms of normality, which are making people think, hang on a minute, what do I do? The other one is obviously climate protests and the issues around the Extinction Rebellion have been raising, plastic and waste, which has been a bit of a slow burner and come up, air quality in London. I think these issues are starting to kind of make an impact in people's psyche. So that, unfortunately, is out of our direct control. In terms of supporting employers, I think this is the real challenge, and I'm not sure that there is a one-size-fits-all approach. So large employers will respond to regulation and get ready, and they have the resources. So if they go down one route and they get it wrong, they can go down another route, they can afford to do it. As you go down the food chain, those don't. So I think if you are going to declare climate emergencies, there almost needs to be that. I tried to find some examples of it on the way here, and I must have been searching, I couldn't find any. But there are examples of when you have disease outbreaks, and what happens in a disease outbreak. You get leafleting, you get very clear, sensible messages. What you should be doing is staying in your home, doing this. We saw it in Paris, where when Paris was severely affected by the heat wave, the actions that were taken there, in terms of the government and the messaging. And I think if you're going to go down a climate emergency route, and you're going to try and engage with those employers who have fewer resources, it needs to be almost that 5-point plan. So these are the skills you need to concentrate on. This is how much you need to allocate in terms of skills and training for your staff, and give them ballpark figures in terms of what they can do. I don't think that there is an answer which will cover the kind of the vast majority of our economy, which is SMEs, because they're all different, they'll all respond in different ways, and they will all understand, they will all assess it in terms of what's their acceptable risk. Again, reading a few annual reports and integrated reports and sustainability reports in the last few weeks, there seems to, and these are very large, these are FTSE 100 companies, FTSE 250 companies, so that's a different sector, but they understand that there is a need to start directing their workforce in a slightly different way. Some say this is a major change, some are saying this is a gradual piecemeal change, and actually this is what we need to do. But there is this slow recognition that they need to do it. How you support smaller organisations to do that, I'm afraid I don't have the answer, but if you are going to declare climate emergencies and say we have a crisis, then you treat it like as if you are talking about a pandemic, or you are talking about a national risk. There's a really good example in Sweden, which is the one I was trying to find, about, and I'm not being alarmist here, where they were worried about heightened tensions with Russia, and they talked about what you do in the case of a nuclear fallout. And it was just I think it was a bright yellow leaflet. It had 5 points on it. And I think if you want to communicate with the general population who say, I don't know how to engage with this, I don't know what to do to get to net zero, I hear this term, to me this term is over here and action is somewhere over here, and I don't know how to get to the two. You need to simplify this thing into the 5 small things that they can do as employers to make their business resilient, make their workforce resilient, make their workforce skilled, and say, this is your timescales, and be realistic on that. I don't quite have an answer for that, because I think it's different for different parts of the economy. I think it's very difficult to say there's one thing that works for people.
Thank you. I think the other areas have already been covered at various points.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So in which case we're going to move on to Sean, who's going to ask some questions about the further questions about the labour market in a low carbon circular economy.
Before I go into that, just a question maybe I'll put to Graham and Bevan. Is there any formal work being done to look at what the job potentials are, the jobs that will go away, the jobs that will come in? This all has shades of the fourth industrial revolution, doesn't it? You know, we won't no longer be having any miners, but everybody needs to know how to program. Has someone formally looked at this, either from a business perspective in individual businesses, or sort of from an academic perspective across the whole piece around a carbon zero economy?
I mean, there is certainly work out there. I mean, as I say, my background's more from the trade union side, and I know that we've been looking at doing that. I mean, there is quite a well-known publication called 1 Million Climate Jobs, which is looking at the whole economy and seeing where the potential is for new jobs, and ensuring that they're linked into a strategy around an LCCE. So that's one piece of work, and of course there are various academic institutions that are also looking into this as well. So there is research that's being done. The TUC has done research as well. So my knowledge is primarily around looking at it from the point of view of, if we're going to try and get workers on board with this agenda and support their employers if they want to engage with them, then they need to be convinced that these jobs are out there, that if they're in a vulnerable position in terms of an industry which may suffer as a result of the transition, can we convince them that there is alternative work which, with retraining and social protection, they could still find a place in? Rather than being put on the scrap heap, which is, unfortunately, if you look at the history of this, not just in the UK, but over the years, that's what's happened. When one sector has declined, obviously the obvious example being the mining industry in this country, that is where you then have communities, not just the workers themselves, but whole communities that suffer as a result. And so, therefore, I think, if we're talking being meaningful about trying to attach a just transition to what we're doing here, then that means that kind of job generation, and also building on the research, because to go back to your point, there isn't enough out there in terms of convincing arguments around, well, what is this going to mean in terms of the growth sectors and how that's going to play out over the next 10, 15 years to make those job opportunities possible.
Okay.
I totally agree that there's a few universities. Leeds University, I think, has done quite a lot of stuff on kind of low carbon and business. There's a lot of fairly good government data out there. The Aldersgate Group are one which have done quite a few case studies, and I'm just going to quote from one of their case studies in a minute. I think the best place to look, there are a couple of things. I think one, on a macroeconomic level, there needs to be, almost like you do with flood risk, there needs to be a managed decline of industries. We've seen that there are traditional industries in the UK which are going to move to different sectors of the world. Now, whether or not we think that is inevitable, or whether we should be looking at that is a different matter. But if you are going to be looking at things like, for example, the steel industry, and there may not be rescue for the steel industry in future governments, there may well be, we don't know, then if that is a risk, you need to have a plan B for that risk. And I think some really good examples of what you've seen on Hull and Humberside and Grimsby in terms of the low, in terms of renewable energy economy, in terms of wind turbines in particular. So that is a decision that was made at some point in time to move, you know, industrial jobs or low-level industrial jobs into those sectors because of the issues that we've had in Hull and Humberside and those areas in the last few years in terms of employment. I spend a lot of time up there, and you've seen organisations like Siemens move into the area and really impact on people's lives. I think there needs to be an assessment by governments to understand which of their industries, heavy industries, are most at risk of moving abroad. And I think there needs to then be a managed transition to say, well, actually, we will keep that industry, or we will manage that industry so that people who have got skills in those areas could move into a wind turbine industry or a solar panel type operation. So I think there needs to be...
Bevan, can I just ask you then, because that was interesting that you just said there should be, and Graham just referred to the industrial strategy and the clean growth strategy and the separate skills strategy. Are we in the position where the government has not done this level of forecasting nationally for the jobs that will be created and the jobs that will go, and therefore has done any of that sort of analysis of the kind of skills, you know, where people have, I don't know, been working in shipbuilding and now they might work on a dock floating wind turbines out to sea instead? Has that actually been done at all?
I think some of that work is getting done and some of it's getting looked at. I just don't think it's out there in a big enough way for people to be aware of. You know, we have people who, like Graham said, who are left on the scrap heap, who have worked in a particular industry, who have skills, and yet we know that there are certain, particularly manufacturing jobs in this country, which are at risk. And so if the government says, well, actually, what's the position in 20 years' time? Is this industry still going to exist in the UK? Yes, funded. Will this industry exist in a different form in the UK? No. Go to Plan B. And those Plan Bs should be giving people alternative skills and in terms of actually attracting the investment to different regions to say, we think this region is at risk of industrial decline or people moving away from it and depopulation. Actually, let's make sure that investment is focused in this area to be around, let's say, wind turbines, because the wind turbine industry in the UK is a strong example. I think that decision was made on Humberside a while back. And
but Bevan, just to interject, there's two things that leap to mind when you say that. Firstly, the very real prospect of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Secondly, governments worldwide have been very poor at picking winners when it comes to industrial strategy. And thirdly, how far into the future you can see, because my estimation of what's gone on with the wind turbine industry, there wasn't the government who picked a winner, it was the industry who found somewhere physically and socially and from an employment standpoint worked for them and made it happen. The point being, when a government rows in too hard, you sometimes crowd out the innovation. And that leads me to my question here about what are the practical and economic realities for business regarding the cost of developing a low carbon workforce. Because as Graham has tried to highlight, there's a real tension here between the need to green our environment, but at the right pace, so that we can bring everybody along. One, from a support point of view, because our last session sort of touched on the fact that there are costs involved, and if the public's not on side, there's going to be a problem. And there's the social costs, which, if dealt with properly, hopefully, can actually be beneficial. We'd all like to see that. So what are the realities here? Because we talked about the business models. What are the sort of bigger macroeconomic impacts? How do we mitigate them, see down the road?
Well, so if I go back, so the government should be looking at regions which it considers there's a risk here of us losing employment, people moving out of these areas. It should then have its options lined out. So if it's saying, and okay, I get the point that you can't predict 20 years in the future, but we know, as much as we would like to keep the steel industry going in the UK, we know that there is a risk Mm-hmm. So what is the government's A, B and C plan? If this happens, what's the scenario planning? If this happens, we will launch our low carbon skills plan. If this happens, we will keep this as business as usual and there's nothing to worry about. I don't see that level of scenario planning going on, which is why when something goes under or a major investor pulls out or a major company pulls out, we then have hundreds of people at risk of their jobs with no actual real plan B going on. And these things don't happen with a nice lead-in. People just lose their jobs overnight. So I think that's when the government's plan would kick in, or beforehand, if it's getting the signals from who the external investor or whoever it is saying we are likely to be closing this plant down. That's when your skills plan pulls in. And I think the reality is these things take years to go along. If you are going to get someone from working in industry A into industry B, the reality is they're going to need a university level of education, but without a degree necessarily. So they're not going to have to sit in university for 3 years, but they're going to need a really high standard of learning, whether that's practical or classroom learning, in order to get their skills from where they're from here to where they need to be. So I think that the reality is it takes a couple of years. This is why the government needs to have scenario planning over what happens with these industries in terms of A, B, C and D. I think that's issue. I'm not saying that the government says, say goodbye to the steel industry tomorrow, it's all going to be wind turbines and rainbows from now on. It's going to be, these are the options for this economic area. Can we put a medium-term investment strategy in place to make sure that we make the conditions right for this area if there is that decline? If we do realise there's going to be a decline, then we manage it properly with skills, getting the right employers in, getting the right businesses in, and the government creates the environment. It doesn't necessarily direct all the action.
So having said that, Laura, I suppose the challenge is which level of government does that. Obviously, the more regionalised the government that does that, you're likely to get a higher level of accuracy because you're just physically on the ground, you're there. And as much as this, we have often, in the context of this conversation, spoken about it as if it's a negative, there's also maybe a positive, and we really hope so, because I think the lowering of our carbon is a done deal. It happens, or we have a serious life-threatening problem on our hands. So what work has been done in London to look at London's orientation to these coming changes? Because, of course, we are not a heavy industrial heartland. We have a very different economy. Has anybody looked at the effects, what it will cost the London for tournament, and I mean all of us, from employees across the business? Is there any work being done about how we at City Hall could be supporting that transition and in any sense is pushing it along?
Yeah, there's a number of initiatives. So Bevan touched on the need for higher level skills to respond to some of the occupational skills required for a low carbon economy. And one of the things that that the Mayor is delivering is the Mayor's apprenticeship programme. So there's a specific priority around 2 pilots that will be launched in the next few months around low carbon sector needs, and particularly providing support to businesses to access apprenticeship levy funding to upskill and retrain their workforce. So that's providing direct support to businesses. The other thing that is planned at the moment is the Skills for Londoners Innovation Fund. So this is part of the package of funding around the adult education budget. And whilst for the time being the Mayor has made a commitment to not make any significant policy change in relation to adult education budget, to not destabilise the provider base, alongside that he will be launching the Skills for Londoners Innovation Fund, which is looking to fund innovative provision which responds to priority sectors, and one of the things particularly identified is to target carbon intensive industries that do exist in London. So that will be happening over the course of.
Could you give me an example of a carbon intensive industry?
I don't have that information to hand, but I can come back to you on that.
That would be great. And my last question is, why hasn't any work been done with the providers of the education in London? Graham made a point about further education and the sector, and for many of the poorest communities in London, further education is absolutely, there is not words to explain how important further education is for the poorest communities in London. Mm-hmm. Has anything been done with that portion of our education, our educational tournament, to say to them, what do you think you want to be teaching in the future? How can we support that? Is there industry that we can get you in contact with that your cohort would naturally go towards that will be changing? Mm-hmm. Have we looked at that, how that pathway will change in the future? So further education's activity should start to change now. Have we had a look at that?
Yep, so we've put in place a number of mechanisms to ensure that the Mayor is advised on how he can apply the adult education budget to bring providers, but both employers in, to have a joined up discussion around that. So there's the Skills for Londoners business partnership, and then an equivalent provider group as well that will be advising the Mayor on issues and particular gaps that they identify. The Mayor has the ability to set policy around use of the adult education budget, and I mentioned that not a significant amount of policy change has been made just yet, but what he has done to ensure that we target particular groups that may be furthest from the labour market is focus funding policy on providing full funding for courses for those Londoners who earn below the London living wage. There are also priorities around SEND learners, targeting various disadvantaged groups, providing wraparound support to people who may find it more difficult to access further education, so such as sort of childcare support, and then also priorities around ESOL learners as well. So and that's alongside the sort of basic digital entitlement that I've already mentioned, and the adult education budget has a statutory responsibility to fund basic skills in English and maths as well. So there's a range of there are some policy initiatives that have that are being put in place with adult education budget, and a significant opportunity to take account of that in future years' allocations of the adult education budget, and the Mayor is consulting on that on an annual basis.
Okay, thank you. I'll put that with you.
So I'm going to ask a couple of wrap-up questions that will just sort of pick up anything that we've not covered so far. I think you've talked about the Skills for London Innovation Fund. Is there any other kind of support for businesses or skills development that is being brought forward by the GLA to support Londoners in this transitional period?
Absolutely. So I mentioned briefly the Mayor's apprenticeship programme. So we will, through that programme, be providing support directly to businesses to ensure that they make use of a funding pot that already exists there.
This is through the apprenticeship levy?
Yeah. Absolutely,
yes. As you said. Okay, and I'm not going to ask you about the adult education budget because I think we've just covered that off. There has been some money coming in from the EU that has given us some support through the European Social Fund and also the European Regional Development Fund. Will the loss, I've no idea whether we're going to Brexit now or not. I mean, I don't think anyone knows anything about anything, but let's assume that we lose access to the ESF and the ERDF. What would the funding implications be for us, or would that not impact on this low carbon circular economy transition area at all?
I mean, any loss of funding, I think, will mean that we have an ability to do slightly less. But I think we can we can mitigate that by looking at the opportunities that the adult education budget, sorry to mention that again, but that would provide us with in the future as we can deliver it and learn more about how we can use that to deliver to support the delivery of skills provision which might be lost where European funding falls.
Okay, so you feel that those budgets are resilient in the sense that the Mayor would be able to find other sources of finance from elsewhere other than Europe to continue with them?
Well, the adult education budget is allocated by government based on previous year's delivery. So if we demonstrate that we are spending it all and using it, then there is a case to be made for more funding.
Okay. Thinking in terms of the skills that people will need, what changes, if any, will the average Londoner have to make to work in the low-carbon circular economy? And I'm going to start with Bevan and then go to Graham on that one.
The average Londoner, I think...
If that person exists.
If that person exists, yeah. I think one thing, if they're employed by an organisation, they'll have to make demands of their employer. So that's one of the things to say. You know, I think in every company, whenever they do their budgeting and forecasting, they will always allocate an amount for staff training. I think they're going to have to allocate slightly larger numbers per head. These are and I'm talking about the very organised organisations here and companies. People are going to have to demand it of their employers. So if they are worried about the climate crisis, they are going to have to say, how can I direct my job towards this? For them to be able to do that, they're going to have to know what that actually means. They're going to have to think about what that means for me as an individual. But equally, the businesses or the organisations they work in are going to have to be putting out messaging, so it comes from both ways. I think that's that. I think what they're going to have to expect is they're going to have to go back to school essentially for some level of training, retraining. Now that depends on your level of job. Obviously, there are qualifications and things like that, depending if you're a white collar worker or a blue collar worker. But that's going to have to be clearly identified, and they will have to be very rigorous. It's that thing around not going for the first course that you see that says climate change in it. It's about shopping around and making sure you do your research and what the outcomes will actually be, what that means for your career. I think people will have to embark on career change, and there are a million websites which tell you about what to expect from the career change. So there are people who are going to have to make those decisions about changing their careers. And then just to flip that a bit, there is something around climate change and sustainability professionals are also going to have to change. I think what you see at the minute is if you go out into the world as an adult, so let's not say you're doing as an undergraduate degree necessarily, but you're doing a postgrad, you go out in the world and you say, I want to learn about climate change. And you will find a degree which is called Sustainability and Climate Change or Sustainable Development. What you won't necessarily get are degree level courses. Sorry, I keep saying degrees. I mean degree standard courses. I don't mean necessarily everyone has to go back to university. But that level of teaching, that you will find a separation. You won't find a sustainability and climate change course which essentially gives you MBA level skills. You know, you don't find those courses in huge abundance to say there is a crossover, so that me as a sustainability professional or a climate change professional, taking my skills beyond where they need to be, I will almost have to do a separate business course or a separate public sector management course in order for me to get my knowledge there. I think that's one weakness that we have in our industry as sustainability professionals, is we go in as the sustainability person or the climate change person, but we don't necessarily go in as the person who can go and talk to the finance team or go and talk to the director of development or go and talk to people who work on the front line. I think that's one of the big things that's lacking in our climate change sustainability industry. We tend to have conversations up here when they need to be had all the way through. And that's just one thing that I think that flips that slightly, because I will go into an organisation, I'll work there for 3 months, and then I'll leave. And I'll reveal some nice, interesting things for them, which ensures I get paid, and they go, that's really interesting. Have they implemented that? When I do my follow-up, they probably implement about 20% of what I say, 10% of what I say. For it to be meaningful for them, they will have to have the staff who understand it, they will have to have the staff who get it, and who are able to implement it, understanding that carbon story, for want of a better phrase, that sits behind that. So I think there are a lot of things that Londoners will have to expect. And I think the realistic thing they need to be is, which unfortunately we don't have, is these things take time. If you want to be someone who goes into an organisation and works with them to get them to be a zero carbon organisation, it takes years. It's not a quick turnaround. If you're trying to retrain yourself, it takes time. So I think that's one of the things.
So I think what you seem to be saying, and I'm going to bring Graham in, and this is going to be sort of like pretty much the final points that you make, is that it just needs to be threaded through into everything, both for businesses and for employees. I know that the Mayor is in the process of producing the new City Hall industrial strategy. We've just seen the data that is going to that will sit behind that has just been released publicly, actually. Do you think that sustainability and understanding of the low-carbon circular economy needs to be threaded into the new industrial strategy to try and achieve this more holistic approach, rather than having it always as a bolt-on? And is that the way forward for London, indeed, and anywhere else?
Yeah, I'd say that I'm very much so. I mean, it sounds like common sense, really, but, you know, when you look at it, it's just not happening, is it? And, you know, Bevan made the point about, even in the HE sector, where you expect, you know, in a way, given their resources, a much better approach and their track record, but it's so uneven. I mean, there are some institutions that really do make an attempt to actually spread it right around the whole of the course offer. But that's the exception still, rather than the rule, even though there's been years and years of different organisations, including my union, trying to press for this. It's still a major problem. And I think in terms of threading this through, another thing that I suppose we need to recognise is, you know, our international commitments. You know, we've signed up for the Paris Agreement. Article 12 of the Paris Agreement says that public bodies and governments should be providing climate change awareness and education. That's something we've committed to. And yet, you know, we've seen that that's not actually what's happening. More so in schools, perhaps. You know, the problem is, you know, kids go to school and they go to FE in particular, it just drops completely, and depending on which university they choose, it's not continued pretty much after that as well. So I think, you know, if we can find a way of looking at the different strategies that are part of the London plan to make sure that that threading in is done, then that would be, you know, a major step forward.
Well, not the London plan, because that's now with the inspectors, and some of us, Caroline and myself particularly, spent quite a lot of time with the inspectors during the examination in public, emphasising some of these things, from embodied carbon, operational carbon, and a number of other climate-related items. But I was talking about the industrial strategy. But I think I'm going to pull it together there and just thank our second panel for their contributions. And I'm just going to ask the committee if you can note the discussion that we've had both with panel 1 and panel 2, and if you will delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with the party group leads to agree any appropriate outputs from this meeting.
Agreed.
And I'm just going to wrap up the meeting with a couple of extra items. The Economy Committee Work Programme, which is on pages 143 to 146 in your agenda. Can I ask the committee to note the programme?
Noted.
And the date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 29th of October at 10 a.m. It's a shame it's not the 31st of October, that would be so appropriate. The 29th of October in the Chamber in City Hall, if you would care to note that. There is no other business that I consider to be urgent. I declare this meeting closed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.